focuses on the systemic barriers of education. While that information is important, as a Southwest community, there are many different vices from which systemic racism can be derived, and addressing not only the effects of these systems, but the history and evolution that produces and reproduces itself in Minneapolis, as well as in Linden Hills, is crucially important. So I gave you as an answer to that question, but then I asked one more before we begin. And that is, does this actually make a change? And I want to start off with a story of something that actually just happened yesterday. Like any good student, I was sitting in the library cramming to finish this presentation. And I was pulled over by another student, and I'm not going to say their name. But this student came and sat down next to me. And for a minute, it was pure silence. And then the next minute, they turned over to me and they said, "You know what, I just can't contain myself. I have to tell you something." And I'm like, oh boy, this is gonna be great. And he looks over at me and he says, "You know, even if what you're doing, or you don't achieve your goals, if what you're doing isn't making an impact, I wanna let you know that you'd inspired me. And I made a presentation right here that I'm actually presenting to a class today. And I want to let you know that I'm doing this because of you." And regardless of a testament to whomever's capabilities or whose ability to come up on a stage and say a couple of big words, what is very important is, at least to me, is that if I can get up, or if anyone can get up, and they can inspire a student, if they can fuel the fire to the fight that people have to face every single day, if those small challenges, those everyday struggles can be overcome by the simplest as you inspired me to do this, or you're the reason why I keep going, or I learned something from you and I've held that forever, then that in itself is just as much as I could ever ask for. And so when we engage in work around equity, whether it be at home at a conversational dinner table, whether it be, Thanksgiving, which is notorious, or whether it be within a classroom or a conversation with a coworker, that in itself can be just as much equity as holding up a sign and marching down the street. And although it might not get credit for it, it's those everyday little challenges and those little steps. That's what's going to get us there. There's no one person or one action that is going to solve any problem, but what it takes is working together. And so regardless of the long, hefty motivational speech, I'm going to get started. My presentation is called Understanding Systemic Racism Locally. So to fully understand our history as a nation, or our history in general as people who live in Minneapolis, we must establish an ongoing understanding of the history of the United States. For this presentation, in the beginning, we will slightly glance over two largely overt practices in the United States that have dramatically influenced not only the nation, but the city of Minneapolis. Crash course, early racism in the United States. So probably the most obvious, slavery was a large part of U.S. history. First used in early colonial periods for tobacco cultivation, later revived by the booming cotton industry in the South. Slavery, the system in its entirety was purely economic. It led to cultural degradation, lynchings, which were no strangers to Minnesota, Jim Crow, the cultural normalization of black inferiority and black death, has covertly shifted, as Michelle Alexandra put it, in The New Jim Crow, to mass incarceration. But the most obvious racism in cases, the obvious overt racism in most cases is unacceptable, noting a resurgence in white nationalism participation in the past year or so, which more or less has been condemned by the majority of Americans, according to an ABC poll that showed 9% of Americans believe that it is acceptable to hold a white supremacist view. But there is another often overlooked historic component, the mass genocide forced assimilation, and pillaging of indigenous people on the land we currently stand on. Early history of our city can be traced back to Fort Snelling. Through an often dubious and elusive treaty process, the United States purchased land overlooking the confluence between the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River. There, a sacred meeting space for indigenous people across the region became the first U.S. military post in the growing Midwest region. A loosely held treaty known as the Treaty of St. Peter's expanded the fort's presence east and west of the confluence. This allowed for the settlement of John H. Stevens, drew out a plan site and established Minneapolis in 1854. Minneapolis, it's safe to say, is on stolen land, and much of this country required such a means of expansion for economic prosperity and power as a nation, though neither appropriate justification for the death of millions of indigenous people. But as the years progressed, the ongoing implementation of reservations, later studied by Hitler to cultivate concentration camps, and the rampant racism towards African Americans existed in our city. Because of reservation systems in the context of, or the ongoing history of Minneapolis, indigenous people lose their presence, but we would be complicit in the violence of indigenous people whom lands we stand on today if we lose their meaning. This is a picture of Mille Lacs Indian Reservation just north of Minnesota, and a picture of Plymouth Avenue in the 1967 long summers. So now let's analyze Minneapolis in an area of discrimination and segregation. This is a map drawn out in 1935 by the City of Minneapolis Planning Committee. And what they outlined, and I'm trying to find my clicker so I can point, here we go. What they outlined was certain areas are certain groups of people. So right up here, what you have noted, you might not be able to see it, but what is called a slum. And in the bottom part, it's called a Negro section. Up in this northwestern part, we have what's noted as the middle class, which due to white flight and the creation of suburbia in the United States, we lose that area to what recedes as an area for black people, or in this map defined as Negroes. In the bottom of our little southwest corner was noted as the Gold Coast. And if you notice that this is Parade Field and this is Loring Park. You'll also notice the CBD, the Central Business District, which houses downtown Minneapolis and the expansion of that, the working men's homes, the Negro slums out here, foreign-born, lower middle class, all areas of the city of Minneapolis specifically outlined for people across the country. What it also did was it implemented a system of redlining. Oftentimes when we think of redlining, it's easy to think of Detroit, New Orleans, a lot of these big cities with a large population of African Americans, but that happened in Minneapolis. And now what you'll find is if you compare it to that same map that we just looked at, the same areas, that southwest area, is that teal area, which is defined as the best area. What you'll notice is that area that was defined as Negro slum, or the area that was denoted the slum, is what would be called hazardous. So there's this continuation of implementing a mentality of certain neighborhoods have certain qualities. So how has this affected Minneapolis today? Well, really the city follows the same outlines and redlining from over 80 years ago. Up here, what you'll find in that blue area, blue representing a white person, is that you'll find the largest concentrated area, or white people per capita or per block, so to speak, is in southwest Minneapolis, where this school is. What you'll also find is that in North Minneapolis, you have a significantly high population of African Americans, a high population of Indian Americans, that was their legal denotation, indigenous people to this land, in that area of Little Earth, which was established in 1973 as a housing residence. And in that receding areas, again, that suburbia, you have a lot of white people, right? So this is the median household income in Twin Cities from the 2013 census. Again, what it shows is in that Gold Coast area that the money stayed there. It only rescinded into the suburbs. that area, that's where all the money is. In addition, the downtown area is where that highest bracket of median household income exists. And in addition, the areas following that, which we now denoted as North Minneapolis, is in the lowest bracket of household median income. So now we're going to look at two topics that we're going to analyze and sort of pick at when we look at racism within Minneapolis. The first one is going to be Minneapolis Public Schools, and the second one is going to be the Minneapolis Police Department. Now don't shrivel up. These are conversations that are important to have. But again, I'm going to provide you with facts and allow you to take away from what you come with. So this is a map of Minneapolis Public Schools and where the 7 traditional high schools exist. I want you to think back to the maps that we looked at just a little bit ago and think about where these high schools are, whether it be in the household median income, whether it be racially, whatever map you can derive. Think about where we are, where Washburn is, where Edison is, and South. Now, Minneapolis is in no way isolated from segregation, and there was actually a news article that was released 2 or 3 years ago that said the Minneapolis Public Schools was less integrated than it was in 1960. And so what we're finding is that in this time period between about 2004 to 2014, segregation was very prominent within our school district. And now if we look at racial demographic data in Southwest High School, you'll notice that it is more racially diverse than some would think. We do have a higher African American population than North does by raw numbers. We have a higher percentage of African American students than Washburn. And we only have about 55% white students here at Southwest. Now, when we look at racial inequalities within our school, something that this demographic or these data points will not show you is what the classrooms look like. And so I want to introduce a concept called tracking. This concept was one that I cultivated in 2015 while I compiled a presentation for teachers for a teacher workshop on the first Racial Justice Day here at Southwest. And what tracking is a systemic failure that determines the academic success or failure of a student based on their race. So now I'm going to split this up. I'm going to split this up into 2 students. And I'm going to read through it, and I want you to think about these 2 different students. So the first student is David. David's family is highly mobile, and he lives in a neighborhood with immense poverty. David lives with his brother and his mom. He attends his local public school in North Minneapolis. The classroom expectations are that he shows up to class and that his work is completed on time. Circumstantial expectations suggest that he shouldn't care about school, and he should focus on keeping his little brother fed. And David is an average student. Now compare David to Sarah. Sarah's family income exceeds $100,000 a year, lives in a 4-bedroom house near Lake Area. Sarah attends a local public school in Southwest Minneapolis. The classroom expectations are that she shows up to class, participates in extracurricular activities, and has parent figures that assist outside of the classroom, engage in daily activities, and complete all work on time. Circumstantial expectations that she should go to college and graduate high school with a top-ranking percentile. She is an average student. Because David was put into an environment with different expectations than his South Minneapolis counterparts, David was entering Minneapolis High School to be tracked in a regular or lower level course. Whereas Sarah, on the other hand, because of the circumstances where she lived and where she attends school, she will be tracked in a higher level course such as AP and IB courses. And now this is a generalized idea of what these students look like. I want to let you know that the names of these 2 individuals have been changed, and they both have went to Southwest. David, in same standing, academic standing as Sarah, same academic motivation, but totally different circumstances. And through that, were 2 completely different outcomes for that student. Both of them who were friends, and recalling a conversation from this student, David. This student told to me And he said, I wish that I could be doing some of the things that Southwest kids were doing, but I can't. That's because I have to go home, and home isn't for me a big house and a car. Home isn't for me soccer practice and Xbox after school. Home for me is going to work right after school, coming home late, making sure that my brother is taken care for, doing my homework starting at 11 o'clock, and then having to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to catch a bus to come to Southwest High School. And these are realities that students face every single day. Another example of tracking, because I want to be specific on this, because I believe that this is one of the biggest barriers to Southwest, is, again, although the numbers of our school, and it might look integrated on a district-wide fact sheet, for students in AP and IB classes, I'll even recall an English class that I took. I was the second darkest kid in the classroom, and I'm pretty darn white. And if you go to an English class that would be a regular levels class, it must have been in 10th grade, those classes were 50 to 60% students of color. And I want to paint a reality to you, is that although this school might not be segregated, as soon as you walk in and go into a classroom, it is just as every much segregated as if you walked out and went to a different school in the times of 1960 if you were looking at that school. It is exactly the same. And until we start picking apart what's actually going in our school, and I'm not going to be the one to have a solution to figure out our integration problem, but until you start conversing with students and really understanding what's happening in a school, you will never really understand these things that are occurring. This was Minneapolis Public Schools' MCA reading proficiency by race. And what this shows is that all but one demographic of white students, were significantly underperforming. American Indian students performing at about a 20% proficiency rate. African Americans, again, in that same 20 to 21 average. Asian students underperforming at about 45% rate, the last 2016 statistic. Hispanic students performing at about 25%. White students outperforming the state standard by about 10%. And as a district, we're about 20% under the mark for a state level. Now, if you ask me about proficiency, I think that those numbers are outrageous. And I think that you've asked any educator that the MCAs probably are not a most accurate reflection of the learning that actually goes on the classroom. But on the other hand, this does paint a picture for the discrepancies in education that exist not only in the district in Minneapolis, but the district for the state. And that is that the state standards for students of color are nowhere near where the state standard is for white students. And I want to leave this education component as we dive into the Minneapolis Police Department with this. Is I think as a student in general, the only way that we're going to be able to solve some of the most fundamental issues in education is if when there's a decision-making table, if there's a decision-making table, we need to be it. And there's a famous South African proverb that came out of disability activism. And it goes, I wrote this down. I want to give this to you. Something along the lines of, if it's for us and we're not there, then it's not for us. And that is the exact same thing when it comes to education.
Nothing about us without us.
Nothing without us, about us, is for us. Is how it goes. And so, this is really important. Where's racism at Southwest? We're not diving away from this. This is really cool. Let's take a look at our disciplinary data. And oftentimes the administrators and the teachers love to turn their eyes on this. But this is really crucial, and this is really factual, and this needs to be addressed. In Southwest High School, you are 5 times more likely to get referred if you are a black student compared to your white student counterparts last year. Last year, there were more than a double references to law enforcement than the year before. And although in 2014, there was a big conversation about Minneapolis Public Schools about the outrageous number of suspensions that we were handing out. And so you'll notice this sharp decrease in referrals. But at Southwest, going against the district standard, the district average, we've actually managed to increase those referrals from that first year of decrease. I mean, this is outrageous. And there is no way, absolutely no way, that anybody conscious could look at this data and not tell me that there is a problem and that it needs to be addressed. And when we look at data around students who are free and reduced lunch eligible, it paints the same picture. The picture that although the free and reduced lunch eligible students make up about 36% or 37% of our Southwest population, they make up for almost 80% of the referrals in our school. And I want to draw a comparison to something that you might all know, which was Philando Castile. He did not get pulled over 40 times because he was a stone-hard criminal. He did not get pulled over because he was this guy on some watch list. He got pulled over because he was poor. And that's why he got 40 citations. And that's why he had a broken taillight. And that's why he lost his life. And this is no reason why poor students should be criminalized in our school. Now we're going to move on to the police department. And I want to draw this picture, totally new topic, but this was the 1967 riots. Raise your hand if you know anything about that. It happened on Plymouth Avenue where I actually live. I currently live about 5 blocks from where these take place. But now we're going to dive into the data about the Minneapolis Police Department. So the ACLU released a report. They went through about a little less than 100,000 cases of low-level offenses in Minneapolis for our local police department. And a low-level offense means that the maximum sentence that someone can receive if convicted is 1 year or less behind bars and a fine of up to no more than $3,000. In Minneapolis, you are 8.7 times more likely to be arrested for a low-level drug offense or a low-level crime than a white counterpart. In that same data, they found that you are 8.6 times more likely to be arrested for a low-level offense if you are indigenous or Native American than your white counterpart. In addition, the Star Tribune released an analysis of the FBI criminal report that they put out every year. And this was following the death of Philando Castile. And according to the Star Tribune's analysis of racial disparities in police departments across the metro, Minneapolis non-white adults make up twice as more arrests than their adult population under the jurisdiction of the Minneapolis Police Department. And I do this, and I present this information for this reason, is that the same reason why these long summer nights is what they call them, the same reason why those people rioted, were the same reason why people gathered outside of the 4th precinct just about 2 years ago. And I want to use the case for Jamar Clark, not as one to be discussed about who is right or wrong, but more as an outlet for a community that has been continually oppressed and continually in spite of the local police department. There's a famous quote from Martin Luther King. I'm not good with quotes, so I'm going to let you think about that, and if you want, you can Google it. But it goes something along the lines of, a riot is the language of the unheard. And the community of North Minneapolis was a community of the unheard. It was a community that is consistently oppressed by the police department, it is over-policed, and a community that is constantly in the face of the police. And something that I learned just last night when I was trying to scramble some last-minute research for this presentation, is that currently where the 4th precinct exists was the home to the first community center in North Minneapolis. And that community center was at the forefront after the riots in the 70s as a hub for the North Minneapolis community. And And I say that with the intent to put in your head that to some of us, police might mean one thing. And I'll tell you, I remember a couple years ago, our house got broken into, and we had some cops over at our house, and I was with a couple of people, and like half my friends were totally walking inside, oh, what's going on, what's going on? And I had other two friends that there's no damn way I'm getting out of this car. And that is a reality that exists not only within maybe my little friend group, but that exists within Southwest. And so I'm not trying to paint a picture of what police might mean to you, because it might mean a totally different thing. But for some students and for some people within Southwest and within Minneapolis, that can be the most gut-wrenching person to see. And I'll give a story. About 3 years ago, I went up and talked to a board, the Board of Education for Minneapolis. And I gave an example of a student who spoke at Race to Justice Day about the SRO that existed within our school. And now again, SROs here have done, an SRO is a school resource officer, the police officer that exists within our school. And for some students, they are wonderful and have had only positive reactions and interactions with this police officer. But he described to teachers, administrators, and the superintendent in the choir room that when he walked into the lunchroom, the school resource officer would hang on that balcony. He would watch over all the students. And whenever something looked fishy, he would go on his radio and radio down to the administrators and say, go check that student out. And in tears, he screamed to our principal and said, that is exactly what a prison looks like. That is exactly what a prison feels like. And so, painting the picture that there's a dual reality for police. And to shy away from that, regardless of how you feel about them, I believe would be fairly inappropriate. Now, our neck of the woods is no way, shape, or form away from police misconduct or the police discharging a weapon on someone who lives in here. And Justine, she was killed a couple blocks away from Southwest. And that resulted in the shakeup of the chief of police, and probably has substantial impacts on our mayor race. And again, I add that information to this ongoing process of knowledge of how people view police within our community. And a bullet from a police officer doesn't discriminate. And although there might be substantial things that are happening within our police department and within our culture, these are things that we all have to acknowledge because they exist within our community. Which resulted into something like this. Again, these are all actions of a community that was unheard. So I want to wrap up this presentation a little bit early. And I kind of rushed through it because I wanted to take more time tonight for you to listen to some students and about their experience not only at Southwest, but just people living within our city. But before we do that, I want to go through what can we do as people within our community and people here at Southwest. The first thing is get educated. And there are plenty of outlets, not only for students, but for everyone here to get information. Organizations like Educate Yourself, Feminism Club, and GSA. Reaching out to the NAACP branch, who is now under the presidency of Jason Soul. Read a book by a local scholar, Muhammad El-Khati, who I had a chance to. He's actually a professor at Hamlin University. Get involved. Southwest is distinct with its community partnership status. This allows more autonomy in our decision making. And they just unveiled a new committee process here at Southwest. So I'm going to give you the dates for those. They happen on the late start dates, and the next one that they have is November 9th, and that's a Thursday. And so if you are any so moved to get involved here at Southwest, that is a perfect outlet to do so. And then the Leadership Council meeting would be the following Monday, November 13th. Finally, get active. Plug in where you're needed and listen to those organizing. Don't try to go in there and try to push your agenda and change stuff, and don't feel bad when you need to take a step back. In that case, I want to wrap this up early and I want to get the students up here. So, without further ado, I'm going to skip the intermission. If you all could bring your chairs up, we're going to get the panel started right away.